Young doctor changed bandage for female millionaire in a coma. Shockingly, she woke up and Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold, crisp morning in a quiet hospital in New York, the young doctor, James Carter, prepared for his shift in the intensive care unit. He had seen many patients come and go, some recovering, some tragically not making it. But today was different. Today, he was assigned to care for someone who, to the outside world, seemed almost unreachable. The famous businesswoman and millionaire, Victoria Weston. Victoria had been in a terrible car accident just a few days ago. She was in a coma, and doctors had told her family there was little hope for her recovery. Despite the bleak prognosis, James had been selected to provide her care. As he entered her room, he couldn't help but notice how peaceful she looked, even in her unconscious state. Her long dark hair spread across the pillow, her face still and serene. The machines beside her hummed quietly, keeping track of her vitals as if life itself was slowly fading from her body. James, still fresh out of medical school, was used to these types of cases. But something about Victoria's situation made him pause. He had read about her in the news. She was a self-made millionaire, a ruthless businesswoman who had built her empire from the ground up. Yet, here she was, vulnerable, unable to defend herself. His job was simple today. Change her bandages, ensure her vitals were stable, and report back to the team. But as he carefully began the routine, he noticed something unusual. Her skin, despite being pale and sickly, had a softness to it, as if it had not yet fully given up on the possibility of life. As he gently adjusted the bandages, James muttered to her, more out of habit than expectation. "Hang in there, Miss Weston. You've fought hard to get to where you are. Don't give up now." He continued his work, unaware that these simple words would be the spark that would change everything. Just as he finished wrapping her up, he stepped back and prepared to leave the room when something happened. A soft beep from the heart monitor, a sound that had been steady and rhythmic for hours, suddenly quickened. James froze, his eyes locked on the screen. Her heart rate was rising. He quickly checked her pulse, his heart pounding in his chest. There it was, a faint but undeniable sign of life. Could it be? Had Victoria Weston, the woman who was thought to be at death's door, just begun to fight back? James rushed to the nurse's station, his voice trembling with excitement. "Get Dr. Mitchell. Miss Weston's heart rate is stabilizing. She might be waking up." It felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, a miracle that no one, not even the most experienced doctors, had expected. The quiet, sterile room suddenly felt full of possibility. Victoria Weston was not done yet. She had only just begun her fight for life. The moment the heart monitor beeped faster, James felt his pulse quicken. The sterile white walls of the room seemed to blur as he hurried back to Victoria's side. Her breathing was still shallow, but the rise in her heart rate was undeniable. He hadn't imagined it. It was real. A sudden surge of hope filled the room, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the impossible could happen. James grabbed the nurse's call button and pressed it frantically. "Get Dr. Mitchell right away," he said, his voice tight with excitement. The nurse quickly rushed to relay the message. James stood over Victoria, watching the machines, unable to take his eyes off her face. Her features were calm, peaceful, but there was something in the air. Something had changed. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, as if she were about to wake. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but to James, it felt like the world had shifted. He leaned over her, speaking softly. "Victoria, if you can hear me, I'm here. Don't give up now." The words felt absurd to him, as if they were nothing but a desperate plea, but he couldn't stop himself. It felt like she was listening. Another nurse entered the room, and James stepped aside. She quickly checked the monitors, looking for any signs of change. "Heart rate's elevated," the nurse murmured. "Her vitals are stabilizing. Doctor?" Mitchell arrived a few moments later, his presence commanding and confident. He was a seasoned doctor with decades of experience, and yet, Even he could not hide the surprise in his eyes when he saw the change in Victoria's condition. "This is unexpected," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He approached the bed and checked Victoria's vitals for himself. "It seems the signs of recovery are there. We'll need to monitor her closely, but this is a good sign." James felt a surge of relief. They had been so close to losing her, and now it seemed like she might pull through. But there was still a long road ahead. As Dr. Mitchell began issuing orders for additional tests and monitoring, James couldn't help but stare at Victoria. She had become more than just a patient to him. Her fight, her resilience, it was something he couldn't ignore. He'd seen countless patients, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way her life seemed to hang by a thread, or maybe it was the inexplicable sense of connection he felt to her. "We'll be here, Victoria," James whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "We won't give up on you." The next few days were a blur of medical procedures and hopeful updates. Each day, Victoria's condition improved, though it was a slow and steady recovery. She was still unconscious, but her body seemed to be responding to the care she was receiving. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but no one dared to make any bold predictions. For James, every shift was a mix of anticipation and fear. He would stand by her bed, checking her vitals, adjusting her bandages, and speaking to her quietly. He had no real proof that she could hear him, but something inside him told him she could. Slowly, day by day, Victoria's body healed, and with it, her spirit seemed to begin to stir. It wasn't until the 5th day that a major change occurred. As James was finishing his rounds, he entered her room, only to find her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, but she was awake. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. For a moment, James froze, unsure of what to do. He quickly approached the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Victoria?" he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze shifted toward him. There was no recognition in her eyes, just confusion and exhaustion. But that one movement, the turning of her eyes, the slight lift of her head was enough to convince James that she was back. Victoria Weston, the woman who had seemed so far gone, was awake, and she was looking at him. The room was filled with a mix of quiet anticipation and cautious optimism as Victoria slowly regained her awareness. It had been 5 days since she first opened her eyes, and every passing moment seemed like a miracle. The nurses had reported the change in her condition, and the doctors were monitoring her progress closely. For James, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, though he knew the journey ahead was still uncertain. Victoria lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her breathing steady but shallow. Her eyes flickered as she seemed to take in her surroundings for the first time. James stepped closer, his heart racing as he observed the subtle shift in her expression. "Victoria?" he said softly, careful not to startle her. There was no immediate response, but her eyes slowly turned towards him. Her lips parted, and for the first time since her accident, she spoke, though her voice was weak and raspy. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. She remembered. She was aware. He smiled gently, trying to keep his composure. "You're in the hospital, Victoria. You've been in an accident, but you're safe now. You're going to be okay." Her eyes blinked slowly, processing his words, but there was confusion in her gaze. She didn't seem to fully grasp what had happened, or why she was there. It was clear she had no recollection of the crash or the events that led to her hospitalization. "The accident," she murmured, trailing off as she searched her memory. James didn't want to overwhelm her with too much information, so he simply nodded. "Don't worry about that right now. You're recovering. That's what matters." She blinked again, her brow furrowing slightly. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. James was momentarily taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected her to not recognize him. After all, they had spoken several times since her admission to the hospital, even if she had been unconscious. But her gaze was distant, as if she were seeing him for the first time. He took a deep breath and introduced himself once again. "I'm Dr. James Carter. I've been taking care of you." Victoria's expression softened slightly, though there was still an air of uncertainty about her. She seemed to be processing the information. trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James wasn't sure if she truly understood the gravity of the situation, but he could tell that his words had brought her some comfort. He nodded, keeping his tone calm and reassuring. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing my job. What's important is that you're here, and we're going to take good care of you." He paused, watching her closely. It was clear that she was still struggling with the aftermath of the accident, but James knew that recovery was a slow process. He didn't want to push her too hard. Instead, he sat beside her bed, keeping a watchful eye as the minutes passed. As the hours went by, James continued to check in on Victoria, offering her encouragement and providing whatever care she needed. With each passing day, her strength seemed to grow, though it was clear she still had a long way to go. Despite the progress, Victoria remained quiet and withdrawn, as if her mind was still in a state of shock. She rarely spoke about her past or her life before the accident. For James, it was both comforting and concerning. He knew that recovery wasn't just about physical healing, it was about emotional recovery too. He could only imagine the trauma she had endured, not only from the accident but from the pressure of her life as a millionaire. Victoria Weston was no ordinary patient. She was a woman who had built an empire, someone who was used to being in control. And now, here she was, dependent on others for the first time in her life. James couldn't help but wonder how she would cope with this new reality. Over the next few days, Victoria's condition continued to improve. Her body was responding to the treatment, and her memory began to return in fragments. However, she still had a long road ahead. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, but they all knew the true test was yet to come. James remained by her side, helping her through each step of her recovery. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized just how deeply he had become invested in her recovery. And though he tried not to let it show, a part of him couldn't deny the growing bond between them. As the days passed, Victoria's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. Her memory was returning in fragments, though the gaps were still there. She remembered her family, her business empire, but there were parts of her past that remained hazy, as if they had been erased by the trauma of the accident. James continued to be her main caregiver, checking in on her every day, making sure her physical health was improving. Yet, he noticed something more. Victoria, the woman who had once been an unstoppable force in the business world, now seemed like a shadow of her former self. She was quiet, withdrawn, rarely speaking about her life before the accident, and when she did, it was always brief, as if she was avoiding the deeper emotional pain. James respected her silence, but he couldn't help but feel concerned. He had seen many patients over the years, but none like Victoria. She was no ordinary woman. She had built an empire from the ground up, her name synonymous with power and success. Now, she was completely dependent on others for the first time in her life. Victoria had always been in control, a leader in every sense. But here she was, lying in a hospital bed, relying on a young doctor to take care of her. It was a humbling experience for someone who had spent her life on top, but James knew that recovery was about more than just physical healing. It was about accepting vulnerability, something Victoria had never done before. One afternoon, as James entered her room for his daily checkup, he noticed a subtle change in her. She was sitting up in bed, propped against the pillows, her eyes focused on something in the distance. When she noticed him standing by the door, she looked at him with a hint of recognition. "Dr. Carter," she said quietly, her voice still weak, but clear. "You've been here every day." James smiled warmly, trying to ease the tension that seemed to hang in the air. "I'm here to help, Victoria. That's my job." She nodded slowly, her gaze still distant. "I can't believe how much everything has changed. I don't even recognize myself anymore." There was a vulnerability in her voice that James hadn't heard before. It was a side of Victoria he hadn't expected to see. He took a seat beside her, not wanting to push her too much, but feeling the need to talk. "It's okay to feel that way," he said softly. "It's not easy, but you're strong. You've come a long way already." Victoria turned her gaze toward him, her expression uncertain. "I've always been strong," she said, almost as if trying to convince herself. "But now, I feel so lost. I don't know who I am without everything I built." James listened carefully, understanding the weight of her words. He could see how deeply the accident had affected her, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Victoria had built her life around her business, her empire, and now, in this moment of vulnerability, she was struggling to find her identity outside of that. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," James said gently. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to take your time and figure things out. You don't need to have it all figured out today." Victoria seemed to consider his words for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "What if I can't get back to where I was?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not the same person anymore?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "You may not be the same person, but that doesn't mean you can't find a new purpose. Your strength isn't just in what you built, it's in who you are. And that's something no accident can take away from you." Victoria remained silent for a moment, as if processing his words. James could see the wheels turning in her mind, but he didn't press her further. He knew that true healing, especially emotional healing, took time. After a long pause, Victoria finally spoke again. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice soft, but with a trace of gratitude. James smiled, standing up from his chair. "You're welcome, Victoria. Remember, I'm here whenever you need to talk. You don't have to go through this alone." As he left her room that day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. He had been her caretaker, her doctor, but there was something more growing between them, something that neither of them could deny. It wasn't just about physical recovery anymore. It was about emotional healing and rediscovery. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, James believed that together they could navigate it. The days that followed continued to be a delicate balance between progress and uncertainty. Victoria's recovery was slow, but every small improvement was a victory. She had begun to take small steps on her own, with James at her side, always encouraging her to keep pushing forward. But despite her physical improvements, it was clear that the emotional scars of her accident were still deep. Victoria spent most of her days lost in thought, staring out the hospital window, as if searching for something in the world beyond. She rarely spoke of her past life, the empire she had once controlled. And when she did, it was with a sense of detachment, as if those memories belonged to someone else. James had grown fond of her, not just as a patient, but as a person. He admired her strength, her determination, even in the face of such a devastating loss. It was clear that Victoria Weston, the woman who had once been a powerful business mogul, was now trying to piece together who she was without her wealth, her company, and her reputation. One afternoon, as he entered her room to check on her progress, he found her sitting up in bed, a sketchbook in her hands. The sight caught him off guard. He had never seen her engage in something like this before. Victoria had always been the type of person to stay focused on work, her mind always busy with numbers and strategies. But now, she was quietly sketching, her pencil moving across the page with precision. "Victoria?" James asked, his voice gentle, unsure of what he was interrupting. She looked up, her eyes softening as they met his. "I didn't hear you come in," she said quietly. "What are you working on?" he asked, curious. She hesitated for a moment before showing him the sketch. It was a rough drawing of a landscape, green fields, a blue sky, a faraway mountain. There was a simplicity to it that surprised James. "It's just something to pass the time," Victoria explained, her voice low. "I haven't really drawn anything since I was a child." James sat beside her, his eyes studying the drawing. "It's beautiful," he said honestly. "It's different from what I would have expected from you." Victoria laughed softly, though it sounded bittersweet. "I suppose there's a lot about myself that I didn't know either," she said, her fingers tracing the edges of the sketch. "I've always been so focused on building, on achieving. I never stopped to think about who I was when I wasn't working." James nodded, understanding what she meant. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what really matters," he said softly. Victoria didn't respond right away. She simply stared at her drawing, lost in thought. "I don't know how to go back," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to go back to being the person I was before the accident." James looked at her, his gaze steady and kind. "You don't have to go back to anything," he said. "You're allowed to be whoever you want to be now. You've been given a second chance. And that's something most people never get." Victoria's eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed to soften, as if his words were slowly sinking in. "You're right," she said, her voice stronger now. "Maybe it's time to stop looking back and start looking forward." James smiled, feeling a sense of hope fill the room. That's all any of us can do. The following days were filled with more of these quiet moments, small breakthroughs that seemed insignificant at first, but were, in fact, crucial steps in her recovery. Victoria began to open up more, sharing pieces of her past with James, little by little. She spoke of her childhood, her dreams, and the loneliness that had often accompanied her rise to the top. It was a side of her he had never expected to see, the vulnerable, unsure woman beneath the tough exterior. And as he listened to her, James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for her. Despite everything she had been through, despite the mistakes, the losses, and the fears, she was still standing. And for the first time in years, she was allowing herself to be more than just a businesswoman. She was allowing herself to be a person. Slowly but surely, Victoria was rediscovering who she was. She wasn't just the millionaire CEO of Weston Enterprises anymore. She was someone who could feel, who could dream, and who could start anew. And as she began to embrace this new chapter of her life, James found himself more and more drawn to her, not just as her doctor, but as someone who had come to care for her deeply. As the days continued to pass, Victoria's recovery reached new milestones, though not without its challenges. Her body was healing, but her mind and spirit were still on a journey of their own. James had been there with her every step of the way, offering support, encouragement, and a steady presence. The more time they spent together, the more their bond grew. It was becoming clear to both of them that this relationship, which had started out as professional, was shifting into something deeper. Yet, neither of them could ignore the complexities of the situation. Victoria had been a powerful, self-sufficient woman before the accident, and now, here she was, vulnerable, dependent, and in the midst of redefining herself. But it wasn't just about her recovery anymore. It was about learning how to embrace this new version of herself, one that wasn't tied to her wealth or her business empire. She had started to take small steps outside of the hospital room, with James accompanying her on walks in the garden. It was a simple activity, but it meant a lot to her. For the first time in months, she was able to step outside, breathe the fresh air, and see the world from a different perspective. "It's strange," she remarked one afternoon as they walked side by side. "I used to take all of this for granted, the fresh air, the sunlight, all of it. I spent so much time focused on work that I forgot what it meant to just be present." James smiled, looking at her with a warmth that hadn't been there in the beginning. "Sometimes, we need a reminder to slow down," he said gently. "Life doesn't always need to be about pushing forward. Sometimes, just being is enough." Victoria nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've spent so much time trying to control everything, my business, my future, my image. I thought that was what gave me power. But now, I'm learning that real strength comes from surrendering, from accepting that we don't have control over everything." James could see the shift happening within her. It was subtle, but it was there. Victoria was letting go of the idea that she needed to be perfect, that she needed to be the one in charge at all times. For the first time in a long while, she was allowing herself to just be human. The following days saw more progress in Victoria's recovery. She began to take on more activities outside of her physical rehabilitation. She'd started to sketch again, rediscovering the joy she had once found in art. The sketches weren't of landscapes anymore. They were abstract pieces, expressions of her emotions, her journey. It was as if the artwork was her way of communicating what words couldn't quite capture. She would often share them with James, who would sit quietly beside her, admiring her work. "These are beautiful," he told her one evening, after she showed him a new piece. "You have a way of capturing raw emotion, Victoria. It's powerful." She looked at him, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I don't know if I'll ever be the same person I was," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm meant to be something new." James met her gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to be the same person. You get to decide who you want to be now, and I believe in the person you're becoming." For the first time in months, Victoria felt a sense of peace settle within her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had spent so many years living for others, running a company, meeting expectations. being a leader. But now, she was learning to live for herself. She was reclaiming her life, one small step at a time. As she continued to heal, Victoria began to open up more, both to James and to herself. She started to confront the deeper fears that had been buried beneath her success, the fear of losing control, the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of failure. It wasn't an easy process, but James remained by her side, offering encouragement and a listening ear whenever she needed it. With each passing day, Victoria began to trust him more, and in turn, she started to trust herself. The walls she had built around her heart, the ones she had constructed to protect herself from the world, slowly began to crumble. She was learning to let people in again, to open up to the possibility of connection. The healing process was far from over, but it had already begun to change her. It wasn't just her body that was recovering, it was her spirit. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt the weight of her past lifting. She was no longer defined by her business or her reputation. She was simply Victoria, a woman who had experienced great loss, but was also learning to embrace a new beginning. As Victoria continued to heal, her days became more routine, filled with small victories and moments of self-reflection. The emotional scars of her past began to fade, but they were not entirely gone. There were still moments of doubt, of hesitation, as she tried to figure out what life looked like outside of the world she had once known. Despite her growing strength, there was still a sense of emptiness that lingered, one that was not easily filled with art or quiet walks. Victoria's empire, once a source of pride, had been reduced to a distant memory, something she was unsure of ever reclaiming. But she had found something else in this new chapter of her life, something that she had never fully experienced before: freedom. James had been there every step of the way, a constant presence in her recovery. His support was unwavering, but lately, she had started to notice something more in him. There was a warmth in his eyes, a tenderness in his gestures that made her question her feelings. Was this simply a doctor-patient bond? Or was there something deeper between them? The thought had crossed her mind more than once. But Victoria quickly pushed it aside. She was not in a place to consider romance. After all, she was still healing, still trying to find herself. One evening, after a long day of rehabilitation exercises, Victoria sat in the hospital garden, her legs stretched out before her as she watched the sunset. James had joined her, as he often did in the evenings. The silence between them was comfortable, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But there was something different in the air tonight. As the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink, James spoke softly, breaking the silence. "You've come a long way, Victoria," he said, his voice gentle but sincere. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied quietly. There was a depth in her voice that she hadn't intended, but it was true. James had been more than just a doctor to her. He had been her support system, her anchor in the storm. "I just did my job," James said, though his tone was filled with modesty. "You did all the hard work." Victoria felt a rush of gratitude and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. She had spent so much time building walls around herself, but in James's presence, those walls seemed to crumble, bit by bit. He had seen her at her lowest, and yet he had never once judged her. "You've changed me," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. James looked at her, his eyes searching hers. There was a long pause before he responded, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "I think you've changed me too." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Victoria's heart raced as she processed what he had said. She had spent so much time focused on what she had lost that she hadn't realized how much she had gained along the way. Through the pain, through the fear, she had found something unexpected connection. She had found someone who saw her, not just as a patient, not just as a woman who had once been powerful, but as a person, and that person was James. As the evening went on, the connection between them deepened, though neither of them dared to speak of it directly. There was an understanding between them now, a mutual respect, but also a quiet tension. Both of them knew that things could not remain the same forever. But for now, they were content to simply be, to let the moment exist without the need to define it. The days continued to pass, and as Victoria's physical recovery progressed, so too did her emotional healing. She began to take more risks, both in her art and in her interactions with those around her. The more she embraced her new life, the more she realized that she didn't have to be the woman she had once been. She didn't have to be defined by her wealth, her success, or her past. She could be someone new. And that new version of herself was starting to emerge. But it wasn't just about her transformation anymore. It was about the possibility of love, the possibility of connection with someone who understood her on a deeper level. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with each passing day, Victoria felt herself getting closer to something that felt more real, more fulfilling. She was no longer the woman who had everything, but she was finally becoming the woman who knew what it meant to truly live. And, as she looked at James, she knew that whatever came next, she would not have to face it alone. As the days went by, Victoria found herself at a crossroads. She had come so far in her recovery, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But now, something was shifting within her. It was as if the remnants of her old life, the business, the expectations, and the pressure, were no longer weighing her down, but they were still there, lingering in the background. Her body was healing, yes, but her mind was still wrestling with her sense of identity. Who was she now, without her empire, without her title? She had taken tentative steps into a new life, one that was about personal growth. But there was a fear, one she hadn't expected to confront. She didn't know how to step forward into this new life, into something that felt so foreign to her. It wasn't about the loss of wealth or status, it was the loss of certainty. It was the fear that perhaps she wouldn't find her way back to a place where she felt strong, capable, and confident. But she wasn't alone in this journey. James had been by her side every step of the way. His quiet support had been her anchor, and she had come to rely on his presence in a way that she hadn't expected. But recently, she'd begun to wonder if there was more to their connection than simple companionship. Had it always been just a professional relationship between doctor and patient? Or had something deeper been forming between them, something neither of them was ready to acknowledge? Victoria sat in the hospital garden one afternoon, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It had become a ritual of sorts, these quiet moments where she could sit, breathe, and just be. James walked up behind her, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. He paused for a moment, observing her, before sitting down beside her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, as he followed her gaze. "The world has a way of reminding us to slow down." Victoria nodded, her eyes still focused on the setting. "Sunday. I've spent so much of my life in a rush, always moving, always striving," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "Now, everything feels different. I don't know if I'll ever get back to where I was." James turned to her, his expression soft and understanding. "You don't need to go back to where you were," he said gently. "You've come so far already. You're building something new, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Victoria looked at him, a slight frown on her face. "But what if I'm not the person I used to be? What if I don't know how to live without the control, without the structure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the same person," James replied, his tone steady and confident. "But that doesn't mean you've lost anything important. You're becoming the person you were always meant to be, the person you couldn't be before." Victoria met his gaze, her heart racing. She had always been in control, always the one calling the shots. But now, she was starting to realize that maybe control wasn't everything. Maybe it was okay to let go. Maybe it was okay to not have all the answers. "And what if I don't know what comes next?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. James reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. "You don't have to know what comes next," he said softly. "You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time, and I'll be here, right beside you." There was a long pause as Victoria processed his words. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the same kind of peace that came from having everything under control, but it was the kind of peace that came from trusting herself and trusting him. She wasn't sure where this road would lead, but she knew she wouldn't have to walk it alone. As the sun set lower, casting a warm glow over the garden, Victoria felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in months. The fear was still there, lingering at the edges of her thoughts, but it was no longer consuming her. She was beginning to understand that it was okay to be uncertain, that it was okay to embrace the unknown. The future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced, one step at a time. And with James by her side, she felt like she could take that step, and then the next, and the next. Slowly but surely, she was finding her way forward. As the weeks passed, Victoria's recovery continued to surprise both her and the doctors. Her physical strength had returned in ways no one had anticipated, but her emotional journey was far from over. She had begun to rediscover a sense of purpose, something she thought she had lost when the accident took everything from her. Yet, despite all the progress, there was still a deep sense of vulnerability within her. It was a vulnerability that she hadn't allowed herself to feel before the fear of the unknown, of the life that lay ahead without the structure and certainty she had once relied on. That fear was magnified by her growing feelings for James. Their connection had deepened in ways she hadn't expected, and every time they were together, she felt a quiet pull towards him. It wasn't just the support he had offered her throughout her recovery. It was something more, something she couldn't quite put into words. As she sat in the hospital garden one afternoon, watching the golden light of the setting sun bathe the space in warmth, James joined her. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the past few weeks, their conversations flowing effortlessly. But today, there was an unspoken tension between them, a quiet understanding that something had shifted. James sat beside her, his presence steady and comforting, but she could sense the weight of the moment in the air. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice gentle, as always. Victoria smiled softly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "Better," she replied, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "But I'm still not sure where I fit in all of this. I've made progress, but I still feel lost." James nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I think it's normal to feel that way," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Recovery isn't just about getting your body back. It's about rediscovering who you are when everything you thought you knew is gone." She turned to face him, her heart racing slightly at the intensity of his gaze. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I don't know how to be the person I am now. I'm not sure if I can ever be the same person again." James reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gentle, reassuring touch. "You don't have to be the same person," he said, his words firm but kind. "You're allowed to be someone different. You're allowed to reinvent yourself, to grow and change in ways you never imagined." Victoria's chest tightened as his words sank in. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, her business, her image, her future. But now, for the first time, she was realizing that maybe she didn't need to control every aspect of her life. Maybe it was okay to let go. Maybe it was okay to be uncertain. "But what if I don't know who I am without all of that?" she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice raw and real. James looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Then take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to trust that each step you take will lead you closer to the person you're meant to be." The words were simple, yet they felt like a lifeline to Victoria. She had spent so much time focused on the idea of who she was supposed to be, but now, James was telling her that it was okay to let go of that person. It was okay to be in the process of becoming someone new. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the future lighten. She didn't have to have everything figured out right away. She didn't have to have control. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. James smiled, the warmth in his eyes deepening. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just here for you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the only sound between them. Victoria felt something stir within her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The future wasn't as daunting as it once seemed. Maybe it was because of the connection they shared, or maybe it was because she was finally starting to accept the unknown. But Victoria felt like she could face whatever came next. She wasn't alone, and in that moment, with James sitting beside her, she felt ready to take the next step. Slowly, but surely, she was finding her way forward. And no matter what that path held, she knew she could walk it with him by her side. As the weeks passed, Victoria continued to make remarkable progress. Her physical recovery had been swift, but the emotional journey was far from over. Every day was a reminder of how much she had lost, and yet how much she had gained in rediscovering herself. The sense of control that once defined her life had been replaced with uncertainty, But she had started to realize that this uncertainty wasn't something to be feared. In fact, it was something to be embraced. The transformation was evident not only in her demeanor, but also in her actions. She had begun to take more initiative in her life, no longer waiting for something to change or for the world to give her answers. Instead, she was taking control in her own way, stepping forward into this new version of herself. One evening, after another long day of rehabilitation, Victoria and James sat together on the bench in the hospital garden. The evening sun cast a warm, golden light over the space, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of flowers. James had been her constant companion throughout this journey, and over time, their bond had grown into something neither of them had expected. They were no longer just doctor and patient. There was a deep connection between them that went beyond words. Victoria found herself turning to James for not only support but also for comfort, for companionship. And she had begun to notice how much she looked forward to their quiet moments together. "You've been so patient with me," Victoria said softly, her eyes not quite meeting his. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James smiled, his gaze steady and kind. "You've done the work, Victoria," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I've just been here to help guide you when you needed it." She turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. There was something different in the air tonight, something unspoken between them. "You've helped more than you know," she said, her voice soft, vulnerable. "You've given me more than just physical healing. You've helped me find parts of myself I thought I had lost forever." James felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he looked at her. He had always admired her strength, her resilience, but seeing her now vulnerable, open and raw, made him realize just how far she had come. The walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, and in their place, there was a woman who was learning to live again, learning to love herself and others. "I think you're starting to see yourself more clearly," James said, his voice low and steady. "You're stronger than you realize, Victoria, not just because of what you've built, but because of who you are now." There was a long pause as Victoria absorbed his words. She had always measured her worth by her success, by what she could accomplish. But now, she was starting to understand that her true strength lay not in what she had built, but in who she had become, through the struggle, the pain, and the healing. She was learning to embrace herself, flaws and all. "I still don't know what the future holds," Victoria said, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But I'm not as afraid of it anymore. I think I'm ready to face whatever comes next." James smiled, his eyes full of admiration. "That's the first step," he said. "You're already on your way." Victoria looked at him, her heart filled with gratitude. But there was something more there, something deeper. She realized that over the course of her recovery, she had come to care for James in ways that went beyond his role as her doctor. He had become someone she trusted, someone she depended on, and someone who had helped her rediscover who she was. The connection between them was undeniable, and as much as she had tried to ignore it, she could no longer deny the feelings that had been growing inside her. "James," she began, her voice a little shaky, "I don't know how to say this, but She trailed off, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. James looked at her, his expression open and understanding. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I think I know what you're trying to say." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She had been afraid to admit it, afraid that it would complicate everything, but hearing him say those words gave her a sense of relief. They both knew there was something between them, something more than just friendship. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, they both knew that they didn't have to face it alone. Together, they had already begun to build something new, something that was no longer defined by the past, but by the future they would create together. As Victoria and James sat together on the garden bench, the weight of the moment hung between them, not as a burden, but as an unspoken understanding of everything they had both been through and where they were now. The distance between them had closed in ways that neither could ignore, yet the future still felt uncertain. Victoria had come so far physically, emotionally, and mentally, but there was still a sense of unresolved tension inside her. The decision she faced now was one she hadn't expected to make. Whether to embrace what was growing between her and James, or to let it slip away, unsure of what it would mean for both of them. They had both changed so much in these months. The woman who had once been consumed with building her business empire was now someone who valued the quiet moments of reflection, the importance of the people around her, and the understanding that life didn't have to be rushed. She had started to let go of the pressure, the need to always be in control, and in that release, she had found a new sense of freedom. But as much as she had changed, there was still the question of her future. She couldn't escape the remnants of her old life, the expectations, the fear of what would happen if she didn't get back to being who she once was. It wasn't just about her business anymore, but about what she would do with the freedom she now had. James had been her rock through all of this. He had helped her rediscover her strength, helped her navigate the uncertainty of recovery, and supported her when she needed it most. And yet, with each passing day, Victoria felt a deeper connection to him. It wasn't just his role as her doctor, it was the way he made her feel seen, understood, and accepted in a way that she hadn't allowed anyone to do for a long time. Victoria found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. She had built so many walls around her heart, but James had found a way in. As she sat there beside him, she realized that maybe it was time to stop fighting it. Maybe it was time to stop pretending that the connection they shared was something that could simply be ignored. It wasn't just about the healing of her body, it was about the healing of her heart. "James," she said, her voice quiet, but there was a sense of finality to it. He turned to her, sensing the shift in her tone. "I don't know what this is, or where it's going," she continued, her heart beating a little faster. "But I think I need to stop pretending that it doesn't matter. You matter. You've been there for me when I didn't know who I was anymore, and I can't ignore how I feel about you." The words were out before she could stop them, and for a moment she held her breath, waiting for his reaction. James looked at her, his expression softening. There was no judgment in his eyes, just an openness that made her heart ache. "Victoria," he began, his voice low and steady, "I don't know what this is either, but I do know that you've been through more than anyone should have to, and I've seen you come out stronger. I've seen you find pieces of yourself that were buried, and that's something extraordinary. I care about you, more than I've let myself admit." The silence between them deepened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of everything unsaid, everything they had shared in their quiet moments. Victoria felt a surge of emotion, but this time, it was different. She didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel uncertain. It was as if all the fears and doubts she had carried with her for so long had been swept away, and in their place was something solid, something real. "So, what now?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "Now," James said, his eyes locked on hers, "we take it one step at a time, together." There was a sense of relief in his words, as though he, too, had been holding on to something, unsure of how to move forward, but now they had found their way. It wasn't about making big decisions or rushing into anything. It was about being present, being honest, and allowing themselves to explore this new chapter of their lives without fear of what might come next. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the garden, Victoria felt a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to have all the answers. She didn't need to rush. The future was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had James by her side, and together they would figure it out. For the first time, she felt like she could face the unknown, not alone, but with someone who saw her, accepted her, and cared for her in a way that she hadn't allowed anyone to before. The journey ahead was still long, but it didn't seem as daunting as it once had. With James by her side, Victoria was ready to take the next step, to face whatever came next, and to embrace the future, whatever it may hold. As Victoria and James continued to navigate their new path together, the connection between them deepened. What had started as a professional relationship built on trust and healing had transformed into something undeniably more. Victoria had never imagined that her recovery would involve not just regaining her physical strength, but also confronting emotions and parts of herself she had long buried. Her heart was healing just as much as her body was, and James had been by her side through every step of it. Their quiet moments together, like the one in the garden, had become a regular occurrence. And with each passing day, Victoria felt a stronger bond forming between them. Yet, there was still a hesitation, a fear of what moving forward might mean. It wasn't just the past that Victoria had to face. It was the unknown future, the uncertainty of what would happen if she embraced this newfound connection with James. She was no longer the woman who measured her worth by her business or her success, but she was still learning to let go of the parts of herself that had once defined her. James, on the other hand, had always been a steady presence, a constant in her life since the accident. But he, too, was unsure of what would come next. He had cared for her from the very beginning, but he had never allowed himself to acknowledge how deeply he felt for her, not in the way that he did now. Their relationship had always been about healing her physical recovery, her emotional journey, but now it was about something more. Something neither of them had prepared for. It was a late afternoon when everything changed. Victoria had been sitting in her room, sketching again, as she often did in her free time. The act of drawing had become a form of therapy for her, a way to express what words could not. She hadn't planned to share her latest work with James, but as he entered the room, his eyes caught the page in front of her. He stopped in his tracks, his gaze lingering on the sketch she had been working on. It was a portrait of her and him, a simple image, but one that captured the emotions she had yet to fully understand. It wasn't just a sketch, it was a depiction of how she felt about him. James stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Victoria," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, a mix of surprise and apprehension on her face. "I didn't mean to," she started, but he interrupted her. "No, it's beautiful," he said, his eyes softening as he took in the image. "You don't have to say anything. I can see it in your eyes, the way you look at me, the way we've been together through all of this." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had already let him in, how much she had already come to care for him. She had always feared that allowing someone to get too close would make her vulnerable. But now, in this moment, she felt like she could trust him with everything. "James," she said, her voice shaky but firm, "I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I know that I can't deny how I feel about you." James reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "You don't have to know where it's going. We're in this together, and that's enough for now," he said, his voice steady, full of reassurance. In that moment, Victoria felt a weight lift from her chest. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know what the future held. All that mattered was that she was allowing herself to feel, to be present in this moment with James. And for the first time in a long time, she realized that it wasn't about having control or certainty. It was about embracing the journey. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her anymore. The future was unwritten, but she no longer feared it. She was ready to step into whatever came next, with James by her side. As the evening drew on, the air grew cooler, but Victoria felt a warmth settle in her heart. She had found something in herself she thought was lost: hope, connection, and the possibility of love. And in that moment, she knew that with James, she could face whatever the future held, together. As the days turned into weeks, Victoria and James found themselves walking a path that neither had anticipated. The hospital garden, once a place of quiet reflection and uncertainty, had become a symbol of their shared journey, a place of growth, healing, and new beginnings. Victoria had learned so much about herself throughout this process, but the most important lesson was that life wasn't about regaining what was lost. It was about discovering new strengths and embracing the unknown with an open heart. The connection between her and James had evolved, and it was no longer just about recovery. It was about the two of them, together, carving out a future that was theirs alone. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't need to. What mattered was that they were facing the future side by side. Victoria had come a long way. She was no longer the woman who defined herself by her success, her empire, or her past. She was someone new, someone who had learned to embrace vulnerability, someone who had learned to lean on others. She had found peace in letting go, and in doing so, she had found herself again. One evening, as they sat on the same bench in the garden where it all began, Victoria looked over at James. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the horizon. She had been thinking about the past few months, the journey they had shared, and the life that lay ahead. "James," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about who I was and who I'm becoming." James turned to her, his eyes warm, his expression full of patience. He had been there through it all, her darkest days, her moments of doubt, and her newfound hope. "And what have you realized?" he asked gently, his voice encouraging. Victoria took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. "I realized that I'm not who I used to be. But that's okay. I'm still me, just a different version. And this version of me? She's not afraid of what's to come. She's ready. James smiled, his heart swelling with pride and admiration. "You've come a long way, Victoria," he said softly. "I'm proud of you, proud of everything you've become." Victoria smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the setting Sunday. It was a feeling of being seen, of being understood, and of knowing that, with James by her side, she could face whatever came next. The uncertainty that had once filled her with fear was now something she welcomed, because she knew she wasn't alone. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You helped me find my way when I couldn't see it myself." James reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You found your way, Victoria. I just walked with you, and I'll keep walking with you, no matter what." In that moment, Victoria knew that her journey was far from over. The road ahead would still have its challenges, its ups and downs, but she was ready to face it all. She wasn't the same person she had been before the accident, but that wasn't a bad thing. She had learned to embrace change, to let go of the need for control, and to trust in herself and in others. And as she looked at James, sitting beside her, holding her hand, she knew that this new chapter of her life would be even more fulfilling than the one she had left behind. Together, they would write the next part of their story, a story not defined by the past, but by the choices they made in the present. And in that moment, with the sun setting on a new day, Victoria realized that this was just the beginning. In this compelling journey of self-discovery and healing, Victoria, once a powerful businesswoman, finds herself on an unexpected path of recovery after a life-altering accident, a story reminiscent of many millionaire stories where success is measured by more than just wealth. It's about resilience, transformation, and the courage to face life's challenges. As Victoria's physical recovery progresses, she begins to explore deeper emotional territories, questioning her identity beyond her empire. The story unveils a fresh perspective on millionaire stories, where true strength lies not in financial success, but in vulnerability, growth, and the rediscovery of oneself. Throughout the narrative, James, her compassionate doctor, plays a pivotal role, helping Victoria realize that she doesn't need to be defined by her past or her wealth. Their bond deepens, becoming more than just a professional relationship, mirroring the emotional depth found in many millionaire stories where love, trust, and human connection are at the core of personal growth. As Victoria embraces her new self, she confronts the fear of the unknown and the uncertainty of the future, echoing themes often found in millionaire stories where the journey towards healing and acceptance is just as important as the destination. This heartwarming story of love, healing, and emotional strength concludes with Victoria finally letting go of her past and stepping into a future she's ready to face, hand in hand with the person who helped her see the true value of life. Showing once again that millionaire stories are not just about riches, but about finding love, growth, and redemption in the most unexpected places.